After over 4 years of fighting, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice was called on the Western Front, thus ending the First World War. Now it's time for the victors to decide what the world will look like, who was to get what, who would be punished for their part in the war, and also what legacy would they leave to future generations in the aftermath of this great tragedy. Hi, my name is Justin, aka Ghost Reader, and today we're going to talk about the consequences of World War I. This video is part of my Remembering the First World War series, and you can find links to the other videos in the description box below. My main primary source for the information in this video is Margaret Macmillan's lectures, a series of lectures she did called The 6 Months That Changed the World. And basically in that lecture series, she talks about the peace conference of 1919 and the effects that had on the world. So with the First World War over, it was now time to make sure that this would indeed be the war to end all wars. Now it was the time to come together to make a peace that would be lasting and would basically make sure that nothing like this happened again. The peace conference was held in Paris and started in January 1919 and would end in January of 1920. So in total, 32 countries sent delegates to the peace conference in Paris, but the conference was dominated by the Big Four, which were Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, with the big three personalities being President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister of Britain Lloyd George, and the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. So basically, at this conference, the Big Four would get together and they would make decisions about things, and then they would submit that to the other delegates from the other countries to decide if this was something that would be approved. Now, first on the agenda, especially for Woodrow Wilson, who had crossed from the United States to Paris at this peace conference, was the creation of a League of Nations. The purpose of the League was to provide collective security for the nations involved and keep world peace. So if a nation did go rogue and decided to start annexing and invading countries, the League of Nations would get together and either enforce sanctions on them to stop them economically or go so far as military intervention. Now, League of Nations would be created, and at its largest was 58 members in total. However, while it did have some successes, it did have some notable failures, including containing the Axis powers who eventually started World War II. The United States also did not join the League of Nations, which leaves a big what if. If the United States had been part of the League of Nations, perhaps the League of Nations may have been able to be more useful when the Axis powers did begin their land grabbings in Europe and in Asia. However, Woodrow Wilson could not get it to pass through Congress because Congress wanted to put some stipulations into the treaty that was not that Woodrow Wilson did not agree with, and thus he told his supporters not to vote for it, and it basically died in Congress. So the United States, in fact, did not join the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations would actually become the forerunner for the United Nations that would be created after the Second World War. So there were a lot of other issues that the peacemakers at the conference in 1919 had to deal with. So one of those things was dealing with basically the territories that these losing nations had and how were they to parcel them out. Now, Woodrow Wilson didn't really want nations to be grabbing land from other nations. He felt that that was old world diplomacy and that wasn't good. However, there were people, and especially some of Britain's dominions, who demanded that colonies that Germany had that were close to them be incorporated into their land. However, there was a compromise reached, and that will be called mandates. So basically what a mandate is that under the purview of the League of Nations, a country would take over the administration of another country or a territory until they were deemed ready to be basically independent and on their own. There would be three types of mandates. The first mandate, Class A mandate, was created for the territories that England and France would be taking from the Ottoman Empire, which is now being called Turkey. Class B mandates were mandates given for the colonies in Africa that Germany had, and supervision for those former colonies were needed to be by countries that had colonial experience before. And Type C mandates were basically mandates that were given to countries to take care of or to administer land that was close to them, but they could administer them as integral parts of their own country. So Australia did this to some of the Pacific possessions that they took or wanted to take from Germany. South Africa did the same in Africa, and Japan also got islands in the Pacific, which many American and Australian and New Zealand soldiers would die fighting for in the Second World War. Now, this mandate system was used to parcel up part of the Middle East as well, and the British and French received mandates. And also, as part of these mandates, was also created a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And so, the provisions were made for Jews to return to Palestine. And this is because a lot of Jews have been experiencing, and for centuries really, has been experiencing very bad relations with European Christians in Europe. And so there were pogroms from time to time. They were blamed for things like the Black Death. And so a lot of Jews basically wanted a place for themselves where they could be, basically have a homeland for themselves. And in the League of Nations made a provision for them in Palestine. And this is the beginning of the troubles that we see now between Israel and the Palestinians about the homeland, whose homeland it is, and we're still trying to find a solution to that problem to this day. And the British and French also caused a bit of trouble as well in this area, because they had promised the Arabs certain things when they got their support against the Ottoman Empire. However, they had made a secret agreement in which that they would be parceling up parts of the Middle East, and that has also caused trouble or been a source of some trouble in the Middle East today, mainly being that the Arab world has never really trusted the Western world since then. And then back home in Europe itself, they had some other things to worry about. They had to worry about the specter of revolution and ethnic nationalism. Now, in terms of revolution, a lot of countries were in flux. Germany was struggling to kind of keep itself stable. You had the successful revolution of communism in Russia, and there were some worries that perhaps that revolution would be exported to other countries. And you do see some croppings up of communists and socialists moving for revolutions of their own in the countries that they were in. So the peacemakers at 1919 conference also had this in mind as they were trying to decide borders and things like that within Europe itself. And contending with ethnic nationalism was also something that the people at the peace conference had to really try to find a solution for, and it wasn't really a very easy thing to do. One of the reasons is that people decided that we are people based either on, okay, we're all Catholic, or we're all speak the same language, and thus we're a people, and thus we want independence. And when you went to go draw the lines, for example, say you did want to give, say for example, Czechoslovakia, if you wanted to give Czechoslovakia like their own land, if you drew the borders, or depending where you drew the borders, you can end up leaving Germans on the wrong side of a particular border. And so now you have a area that is mainly German speaking, now mixed in with a bunch of Czech speaking peoples, and those Germans may feel that they should be part of Germany. And in fact, some of this feeling was why Hitler demanded parts of Czechoslovakia later in the 1930s, and like took Austria. And so this ethnic nationalism made things really hard for the peace conference when they went to draw borders for countries that were seeking their own independence. So some countries did indeed gain their independence. So you had places like Poland, which had basically been wiped off the map in the 1700s, come back into existence. Czechoslovakia was one. Ukraine did petition for their independence, but it was not granted it. Yugoslavia would come to be its own, be recognized as its own country in this time period. And what you see really here is that these people were coming together and they were making countries. And it wasn't that the peace conference were sitting down and saying, okay, so we're going to make Czechoslovakia. What was happening was in this period was a lot of these people would come together and say, okay, we are Czechoslovakia and we want you to recognize us as that. And so at the peace conference, they were trying to determine whether or not they would recognize these countries, and if they did, what borders they would have. And of course, this wasn't an easy proposition in drawing these borders, because when they made Poland and gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea, they actually split off East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and that of course would cause a lot of trouble going forward in the future. And Poland actually had a lot of trouble with its borders. It was arguing with Hungary and Czechoslovakia over its borders, and of course this whole border dispute over what is Polish and what was German, or what was Russia thought was theirs, would basically rear its ugly head at the start of the Second World War. And also a very interesting thing about the peace conference, when people look at the peace conference, they say like, well, Germany got the short stick in this peace treaty, and we're going to talk about that later in this video. However, a lot of the people who were on the side of the victors also felt that they didn't get what they needed, and felt that they got the short stick in this peace deal as well. So, for example, the Chinese delegation wanted the German concessions in China to be handed back over to them. However, the Japanese actually were given those lands, and of course this would only add to the tension between Japan and China. The Italians had a lot of territorial demands, especially with the Austro-Hungarian Empire now gone, and they would demand some land that Yugoslavia was claiming as their own. And while Italy did gain a lot of land, there were some territorial demands that were not given to them. And a lot of nationalists and fascists in Italy would then use these claims to kind of push their cause that Italy had been betrayed. The French, also one of the major powers at the conference, also felt that they had been given the short stick because they wanted to have a weak Germany. Germany had invaded France twice before, once in 1870 and again in 1914, and basically they did not want this to happen again. Now we know it did in World War II, but this was a fear that at least the French at the peace conference had, and so they wanted a weak Germany, and they were trying to figure out how they could keep a Germany that was weak militarily, strategically, and also financially. And so there were a couple of ideas thrown out there. Maybe we could break her up, but they said no, that would just cause a lot more chaos there, and it would essentially lead to Germany becoming unified again, probably through conflict. Now the French argued for a very, very weak Germany, and in the end, however, they weren't able to get everything that they wanted. They did manage to weaken Germany, but they, in their eyes, not enough to basically guarantee France's security. However, they did decide to go along with what eventually was called the Treaty of Versailles, in exchange for a guarantee that the United States and Britain would aid France if they were indeed attacked by Germany again. However, the United States was not able to keep up its end of the bargain because the U.S. Congress rejected these terms, and then Britain said, well, if the United States isn't going to be part of this, then we're not either. And so France, in exchange for more moderate terms, quote-unquote moderate terms in the treaty, actually didn't get anything out of it and felt that they had been given the short stick as well. And then there was Germany. The Treaty of Versailles was perhaps one of the most controversial things to come out of the peace conference, because it basically determined what Germany was to pay for its part in World War I. And so Germany was supposed to pay about $32 billion US dollars to the Entente. It also lost about 13% of its land, with Alsace-Lorraine being given back to France. The Rhineland was taken from them as well, but a plebiscite will be held in 15 years to determine whether the people wanted to be part of France or whether they want to be part of Germany. And in the end, when the plebiscite was finally done in about 15 years, they did decide to remain German. They also lost land to Poland, and of course in World War II, Hitler would seek to rectify all of this and take this territory back. So when the terms of the peace treaty were finalized, they were then handed to Germany, not for debate. They couldn't debate any of the terms in the peace treaty. They were basically to look over it, give comments, and then to sign. And of course, Germany really wasn't in the position to do so, even though there was a huge fight back at home in Germany over whether or not to sign the treaty. And the Allies themselves were coming to terms with the fact that they may have to actually invade Germany in order to get them to sign the peace treaty. Finally, the Germans signed the peace treaty on the 28th of June 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and also in the same room, the Hall of Mirrors at the Versailles Palace, where the German Empire had been declared. Of course, for a lot of people back in home in Germany, they did not like the fact that they had to sign this peace treaty and thought that the terms were way too harsh. And actually, the Allies themselves, as time went on, would come to see the terms very harsh as well. Germany, in fact, did not pay a lot of the reparations, and that's because, for the most part, they weren't able to, and would actually go on to circumvent a lot of the things that they agreed to in the treaty. Also in Germany, there was a myth being spread, especially by the German military command, that the Germans had in fact been stabbed in the back. The whole stab in the back theory, that the German military had not been beaten on the battlefield, but in fact it was liberal politicians at home and Jews who had basically betrayed the German Empire to the Allies, and that is why they ended up signing the Treaty of Versailles. But it's always good to think about the what ifs. If, for example, the terms have been less harsh. I mean, is there a possibility that World War II doesn't happen? If France and Britain had not split up the Middle East the way they did, if they had not created a homeland for the Jews in the Middle East, would we have seen a more peaceful Middle East, or is it just inevitable that the Western powers would have gotten mixed up in the Middle East at some time? And the United States, if they had been part of the League of Nations, would they have been just the thing needed to keep the Axis powers in check? Now, could the peace conference in 1919, could the men there have done better? Perhaps they could have, but they were dealing with a lot of things. Communism, ethnic nationalism, a lot of competing claims on things, and they were trying to do their best with what they had. And so it looks like, I mean, I'm not even sure if anyone could have back then could have looked at what was going on in Europe and around the world, and it could have come up with anything better or that would have saved us in the long run from the things that plague us today. Could have been possible, yes, but we'll never know. And so as I bring this series to an end, I want to just remind you all on November 11th, on this Veterans Day or Armistice Day, to remember the 100-year anniversary of World War I, and also remember and celebrate our veterans that come back from serving in our armed forces. We have to remember that they are people, and that our actions back at home, in politics, in our daily lives, public opinion, do impact people's lives, not only in the here and now, but also in the future. I'm pretty sure that Gavrilo Princip, the guy who assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, and didn't think that the 2 bullets that he shot that day will end up not only millions dying in World War I, but also that World War I would then set off World War II, and then later the Cold War, and all those people would die from those 2 bullets that he shot on that day. Also, we need to remember that just because we are more quote-unquote enlightened now, that we can end up in the exact same situation, doing the exact same things as people in the past did. So I want us not only to remember the lessons of history, but also remember that history is lived and felt and experienced by real people, just as we're experiencing history today. And so as we go forward from here, from November 11th, 2018, full 100 years after the First World War, I want to remember the sacrifices of those men, of those women, and everyone that was at home, everyone that was at the front. Remember their sacrifices, and remember that a lot of them had basically a dream for a better world. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos from me, please subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at GhostReach28 and also on Goodreads. The link to that is down in the description box below. So as always, keep reading.